purpose of this film is to show you the installation and operation of a Newport Dickinson diesel fireplace on a Beneteau 423. We're going to spend a significant amount of time going through the startup procedure, different parts of the heater, and we're going to spend much of our time examining the different flame characteristics when you are adding fuel or adding air, and how to get a nice efficient fire going. Current environmental conditions outside, it's a pretty decent, it's a warm 60 degrees outside, it's sunny, but it is sustained around 15, gusting to 20. And I think that'll be interesting for you as you watch the film and you watch and you see how I get the fire started and you see how the fire responds to the characteristics outside. A couple of things to understand about this heater is that the heater itself really responds to the environmental conditions. That the low setting, the high setting is a function based on the environment and the temperatures around you, as well as the type of fuel that you're using and the viscosity of the fuel. So all those are very important factors when you are learning how to start your fire. We've had this fireplace for a year and we used it pretty hard through a season, and so there are a lot of lessons learned that I'm going to go through with you as we examine this fireplace. So this is a Beneteau 423, and this is the installation and use of a Newport Dickinson diesel heater. Just a quick overview of the installation of our Dickinson Newport diesel heater. So the boat that this installation is on our Beneteau 423. And as you can see, this installation is pretty far from ideal. And largely that's a factor of the space that was available to work with, and this compression post to the right. So the compression post goes up and supports the mast, and then you can see next to the mast is the top of the stack that comes through the deck. Now this is not ideal, however it works very well. I was concerned that the angles in the flue here would cause an issue with airflow, but we've used this diesel heater pretty hard for a year now, and we haven't had any issues, and it's given nothing but solid performance. You'll see that I do have the barometric damper there, and I fully recommend that. We've had this thing operating on days where it's blowing 30-40 knots in February, very cold outside, and that thing has worked like a champion, and we really haven't had any backdraft issues as a result. You can see I've got heat shield, and you know, it's attractive, but it also serves to add more volume and make sure that you get more of an efficient heating from the stack here. And then a few things of note. So I've gone ahead and installed the whole stainless steel panel, and this is multiple panels, I should add. And then you'll notice that the top of the panel is relatively smooth, and that's because we don't get a huge amount of heat on the panel here. But below it, I went ahead and installed some automotive heat shielding because this was getting quite hot, and I was getting nervous about the bulkhead behind it. And once I installed this automotive heat shielding, I saw a significant difference in the performance of the heat shielding. As we come around the compression post, we'll see that there is a sizable gap that I left in the heat shielding, and the function of this is to allow cool air to come through here and to make sure that, you know, nothing is getting overheated. And then at the top there's a place for that air to exit up here. And then, you know, again, this is a Beneteau 423, and it really wasn't designed to have a heater of this nature put into it. And as we look down here, we can see the tolerances aren't exactly enormous. And so I went ahead and added another heat shield over here by the couch, and then I added that automotive shielding, and it's worked very, very well. And as we come down the heater, we come to the mechanism, the set screw that determines the amount of fuel that enters the heater. And we live in Maryland, and our winters can range from, you know, mild to pretty extreme. And so what I did, I actually disassembled this set screw and modified how much fuel can enter or the burner pot at any given time. And that was a pretty simple modification, and it's made a world of difference in how well I can control the fire. And to the right over here, and I can barely sneak my hand in down here, is the control for the fan. And you know, I've read on several forums where people haven't hooked up the fan, but after using this thing pretty hard for a year, and also as a result of the type of ultra low sulfur diesel fuel that we're burning, and as a factor of space and airflow, we tend to leave that fan on low, and we get a beautiful lemon yellow flame as a result. So if you're looking to install a diesel Newport Dickinson heater, you know, you can make it work in just about any space, but you want to be mindful of the specs or requirements, and then the amount of heat that the area around it will get. So as we open up our Newport Dickinson heater, you'll see a few things. Now, number one, this screw set can cross thread into that very easily. So be mindful, okay? And you may want to oil that from time to time. Now, as we look into the heater, we'll notice some soot. This is what my heater looks like after 2 uses this season. So inside we have our burner ring, we have our superheater, and we have a baffle. My advice is that you will need this baffle every fire all of the time. And this is because of the different additives in the fuel. This baffle reflects heat down into the burner pot, and what that does is that allows the combustion of materials to be more efficient, and you get a much cleaner, more efficient flame. And that's especially important when you're using ultra low sulfur diesel fuels. So let's talk about lighting the Newport Dickinson diesel fireplace. I've had this thing for a year, and we've used it pretty hard, and I've experimented with a number of ways to light this fire. And you know, the manual says take a paper towel and twist it into a wick, and then essentially they tell you to put it into the burner pot and let that wick up a huge amount of fuel. But I found that when you do that, there's a huge amount of fuel that enters the burner pot, and then you get a pretty nasty fire. And when I say nasty, I mean it doesn't clean very or burn very efficiently. And if you're not paying attention, that's a good way to overheat your burner pot. So after I twist this, I take the poker that they provided, and all I do is tie this around the poker. And I make sure that one end is a little shorter, and I make sure that one end is a little bit longer. And again, I've had a year of trial and error here to come up with this method, and it seems to be the most effective method I've discovered. And essentially what you do is you light it on fire and you drop it in there, and one of these ends makes contact with the diesel fuel that's in the pot, and you get pretty excellent flameage nearly immediately. So now that the fire stick is ready, let's talk about fuel. So you've got your dial here, and it's currently set to off. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial this all the way to maximum fuel flow. Well, the way I have this set up, this actually isn't letting any fuel in yet, because over here, pretty far away from the fireplace, I have a switch, and the switch turns on the fuel pump I installed. Now, I installed this pretty far away from the fireplace on purpose. I was thinking, you know, cruise control in the vehicles, where you have basically a safety feature to make sure that you know that it's on. And I wanted to make sure that it wasn't too close to the fireplace, that the fuel pump wouldn't be triggered by accident. So now I can hear a little ticking of fuel entering the chamber. And then so what I want to do is I want to pay attention to the bottom of the chamber, the burner pot, and I want to start looking for fuel to enter this. And this can take several minutes depending on the viscosity of the fuel, and that's a result of the fuel line running through the bilge essentially. And I should add that we installed a regular pump, and we've got about 20 feet of hose plumbed to my my fuel tank, and I thought it was going to be an issue, but the standard pump primed right up, and we haven't had any issues with it so far. So while we're waiting for the fuel to enter the bottom of the pot, you'll see that I keep this relatively clean, and you'll also see where the soot buildup occurs. From time to time I clean this, and since this is really the beginning of the season, I took a lot of time with a shop vac. I cleaned out all the hard carbon deposits in here because you really want to make sure that you've got excellent airflow through your burner pot. So it's been about 2 minutes, and after 2 minutes I can see that there's a little bit of fuel starting to enter the bottom of the burner pot. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to turn off the fuel supply to the burner pot. So I'm going to reach over and I'm going to turn off the pump, and now I'm going to dial this down. And you can see that I'm not rough with this thing. I dial it down pretty gently. Okay. So now comes the part where I light the doohickey and put it into the burner pot. Okay, so let's see if I can do this one-handed since I've got the camera on the other one. Alright, looks like that's caught. Ish. Nope, negative. Let's try this again. And now I'm going to go ahead and just drop that into the diesel fuel. I'm going to close the door. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn on the vent assist fan, or the draft assist fan that's on the right side of this unit, and I turn it on its lowest possible level. And then what will happen is this flame will grow, and we'll heat the pot. I've just started the fire, and the next portion of this film, the purpose of this is to show you what happens with the fire, its flame characteristics, and when you need to do what you need to do in order to make sure that it doesn't overheat the chamber and you get a nice, excellent fire out of this. And again, I've got my draft assist fan on its lowest possible setting, and it's going to stay there for the duration of this fire. You can see that the fire is burning down below the fire ring, and that's going to happen during the preheat sequence, which is what we're doing right now. This is the preheat sequence to get the burning chamber hot enough where it will start to vaporize the fuel oil. And I can actually hear the metal begin to tink and click and begin to expand as it heats up. Now, right now, this is a pretty dirty flame. It's a sooty orange flame, and I'm sure some of the questions will be, does this diesel heater put soot out onto your deck? And absolutely, yes, it does. During the startup sequence to the fire, we have a pretty dirty flame, and when we turn the fire off, we have a pretty dirty flame because essentially it's starved of oxygen and has way too much fuel in it. And when it's got too much fuel in it, you'll get a brown, dirtyish flame. Now I'm looking at my camera here, and on camera it looks nice and bright yellow, but I assure you that in the real world it's a darker, sootier flame. When I first bought the diesel heater, I followed all the instructions, and what I didn't account for was the ultra low sulfur diesel fuel, and so I had to learn a couple hard mistakes there. So we can see that the fuel is catching, the fire is getting bigger, and that the characteristic of the fire of the flame is starting to change. At this point, if you were to add fuel into this, you would have a fairly significant fire in your box. Okay, so let me show you what I've just done. So we have this barometric damper, and because there's not enough draft yet, because the fire isn't hot enough to really create a nice big draft, I went ahead and put my hand over the barometric damper to make sure that that smoke doesn't enter my boat. And so as I do this, and I really only ever do this for about a minute or so, and I watch the characteristic of the flame. You could go ahead and you could turn up the draft assist fan, but when you do that, you change the amount of oxygen that's entering the combustion chamber. Now you can see that the flames are starting to get a little less, and they're not crawling over the burner pot yet. And so this is the point where you feel like you need to add fuel to the fire. Don't do that yet because there's a lot of fuel in there still. I like to make sure the fuel or the fire is a very low, lazy fire before I add any more fuel. And it looks like it's going out, but it's still got enough fuel in there to burn for some time. And so I wouldn't add any fuel yet. And again, you can see how that flame is changing its characteristic. And you can see how it's starting to turn blue. Again, it looks like it's almost out, and you've got a lot of blue flame. And that blue flame essentially means that it's oxygen rich at this time. And the blue flame is above the burner pot, but below the burner pot we still have thick, diesel rich flame. Okay, I can see the flame is starting to die out there. So, it's like the last gasp of the orange flame. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to dial this to 1.5, almost 2, and that's a result of me changing the setting of the set screw. And I'm going to turn on my fuel pump. And so now I've just added fuel to the fire. And we'll watch the characteristic of the fire start to change. So at this point, you would be tempted to add more fuel or more air. But if you add more fuel or more air to it right now because you think, hey, things just aren't right, nothing in this fireplace responds immediately. It's not a push button, it's not a dial, it's not an electric thermostat. Everything in this everything in this firebox happens as a function of the environment around it. So everything is very slow to respond to the changes. So if you add more fuel, if you turn up the fuel, if you turn up the air, it'll take a while to figure out what's actually happening in the firebox. So right now we can see that the flame is starting to change colors. You're starting to get the occasional flare up, and that's a result of the fuel beginning to vaporize, and the fire, the orange fire, is beginning to move above the burner pot. So we're not quite there yet, but again, I wanted to really show everybody the characteristics of the fire and how it changes over time when you add different fuel to air ratios to the burner pot. So right now, we've got a lot of purple fire, and that means it's fairly oxygen rich. And I would be tempted to turn off the draft assist fan, but again, this is ultra low sulfur diesel fuel I'm running in here. I've got the baffle. I've got the baffle working, and so as it gets hotter, that baffle works better. It becomes more efficient, and the fuel starts to vaporize better. Now you can see that fire is starting to change its characteristic. It's starting to move above the burner pot. Give you a couple different angles here to take a look at, and that we don't have a huge amount of soot in here. When I first bought the diesel heater and I followed all the instructions, which were phenomenal, by the way, I added too much fuel too soon, and before I knew it, I had a glowing red firebox, which was pretty terrible. And since I added a fuel shutoff valve pretty close to the unit, I was able to starve it of fuel. But it did get a little sporty. And so we have a nice bluish purple flame right now, and that's not the flame you want to see, actually. That tells us that this fire is too oxygen rich right now. But again, as that baffle begins to work, the fire becomes more efficient, and the way the fuel gets burned is more efficient. And you definitely want to have this baffle inside here, and it just slips in. Without this baffle, you get a really lazy fire with the characteristics of a fuel-rich fire, and you get a lot of soot on deck. And I can hear that this fireplace is starting to heat up, and I can feel it. It's a very warm, wonderful, dry heat. So since we've started this, you've seen the adjustments that I've made to this flame, to this fire with the fuel and the air mixture, and you can see what the flame has done. And again, one of the whole points of this film was to show you the characteristics of the fire and how it changes over time. This is definitely not a rushed process. So the conditions outside right now, it's currently in the low 60s, and it's blowing about 15 to 20 knots, and every time the wind gusts, the fire is responding, and that's a function that tells me that my flue isn't hot enough yet to sustain a good draft. So they tell you if you burn your fire and it's oxygen rich like this, then you get hard carbon deposits, and that's true. That does happen. And you can see that the fire is now burning above the burner pot, but it's definitely a lean fire. Okay, so we've been working with this fire for a few minutes now. I can see that it's burning oxygen rich, and I don't want to turn off my draft assist fan because it's pretty windy outside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just add a little bit more fuel. So I'm going to turn this dial all the way to 2. And then now that I've turned the dial all the way to 2, I'm really not going to make any more adjustments to the fire. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit here and just watch the fire and make sure everything is kosher and safe and good and that it's not overheating. I find that lighting the fire, depending on the conditions outside, can take anywhere from half an hour to an hour to make sure it's going very well and safely, and that I can go ahead and live inside my boat and not have to worry about what's happening. And so we're starting to get our nice flame, and that's because I added a little bit more diesel fuel to it, and so it's vaporizing. We've got a nice lemon yellow flame. This is a pretty good flame. And when it goes down to the oxygen-rich flame, that's because we just had a blast of wind outside and the barometric damper is working. But even though it's blowing, 15, maybe even 20 outside, there's no backdraft inside the boat, and we've got a nice, beautiful flame in the firebox here. To extinguish our fire, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reach over and I'm going to turn off the fuel supply. And the second thing I'm going to do is reach down and slowly and gently turn off the fuel. And then essentially what happens is the fire is starved of fuel. So we can see what's happening to the fire once I went ahead and turned off the fuel valve. And this whole shutdown procedure, it can take 10 minutes. And so you look into the firebox and you'll think that's completely extinguished, and then you'll see the little lick of a sooty flame down there at the very bottom. It's quite the process. One thing you definitely want to make sure that you don't do is you don't want to touch that knob right there when the fire is going, unless you want to leave a fair amount of skin in place there. The whole heater gets very, very hot. Very, very hot. And so it's very important that the shielding that you have around the fireplace is the type of shielding that can withstand that type of heat. And this automotive shielding is pretty amazing. This right here is cool to the touch. Initially, I thought about tiling this whole area, but we go offshore quite a bit, and I was pretty nervous about what tile would do on this bulkhead on a Beneteau 423. You can see the stickers there. That's from my daughter before we had this thing. So there you have it, the functioning of the Newport Dickinson diesel heater fireplace on a Beneteau 423. So the fire has been extinguished for 12, maybe 15 minutes at this point. And this is now when I'm going to turn off my draft assist fan. The reason why I've left my draft assist fan on this whole time, even though I wanted my fire to extinguish, was that I wanted to make sure that all the smoke was going up through the unit and up through the whole flue here, and nothing snuck into my boat. I found that by leaving my draft assist fan on, even while the flame was being extinguished and well after the fire was out, it eliminated any type of sooty smoke odor coming into the boat. So the question is, would I recommend this product? And absolutely. This diesel fireplace has been amazing. It's been very simple, and that's the reason why we bought it and installed it, because it's very simple. I went ahead and installed a fuel pump with it, but if things really got sporty and something failed, I can plumb it to a jerry can and we would have a nice efficient heat. As I said before, it's very simple, and when you get the instructions, you'll see that essentially it's not necessarily how-to manual to install it, but it gives you a set of references and tolerances that you need to adhere to as closely as possible. We were able to install this on a Beneteau 423, and for this boat, this fireplace, on a really cold day, will do an excellent job of keeping this boat warm. This brings us to the end of our video. I hope that my discussion and instruction and lessons learned through this video have been helpful to you as you decide to move forward with your own purchase and installation of a diesel fireplace. I'll tell you, it's been a wonderful addition to our Beneteau 423, and I really enjoy my winter cups of coffee by the fireplace in the early morning. Thank you, and good luck with your installation.